Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on this show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer. Today's podcast is brought to you by In Wolf's Clothing. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times per year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that help fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. So go to wolfnyc.com to learn more about the program or apply. Again, that's Wolf NYC, WOLFNYC.com. Luke Gromen, welcome to the What is Money Show.
Thanks for having me, Robert. It's great to be here. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, man, it's been a long time coming. I think we've been talking about this since I launched the podcast. And, things just take longer than you expect sometimes. But I'm really excited to finally have you on. You don't need much introduction, but I'll give a brief one anyways. You are the founder and president of FFTT. How would you describe FFTT? You guys are like a global macro research firm, or what exactly? How do you describe yourself?
Yeah, I call us a macro and thematic research firm. We're dot connectors. We aggregate a large amount of publicly available data in a unique manner, trying to help our clients.
Fantastic. And you've become very well known for your deep insights into geopolitics, macroeconomics, energy markets, monetary systems. You've really got a breadth and depth of knowledge that's quite well reputed, I would say. And so I'm very excited to talk to you today. So as I proposed to you offline, you had published this piece. It's a research report titled Peak Cheap Energy and Monetary System Change. I think you said you published this about 18 months ago?
About 8-9 months ago for our clients. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is just something that's great to talk about. As you mentioned offline, the positions in the piece have aged well. It's really timeless material. You're talking about very big picture stuff. Where U.S. bond market is going, government bonds, energy markets, et cetera. So I think we should just jump into that. Is there anything you want to do to set the stage before we kind of dive into the piece itself?
We should just dive in because it's really designed to sort of set the stage and then work through it. So I think if we just follow it and, through it in that way, I think that'll accomplish doing exactly that.
Okay, fantastic. So I will start on, and this is for the audience, this is a pinned tweet on your profile, which links to the research report. So if anyone wants to follow along, they can go and download it there. And so I'm going to page 2 of that report, and you basically open with this quote from Bank of International Settlements Chair Jel Zijilstra from 1980. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they said that the second oil crisis could be worked through slowly, but the international financial system could not survive a third oil crisis. The inflation would make it impossible to recycle the petrodollars to the oil importing countries with any hope of repayment. And you have a note here in real terms, real oil terms. Trade would crumble and the system would be brought to its knees. Can you help translate what that means? There's a lot of terms in there people might not be familiar with, like petrodollars, um, and trying to understand how this would affect uh, trade and the financial system more broadly.
Absolutely. So let's boil it down for simplicity's sake to a single oil exporter. Let's boil it down to Saudi Arabia.
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia right now produces the oil that they export of what they produce is roughly 20 to 25% of net exports, of global oil net exports. In other words, there's global oil production minus what those producers consume themselves.
Mm.
Whatever's left over is net exports. Okay, so what that quote is essentially saying is that the system as it has long been structured, oversimplified, is Saudi produces oil, sells oil only in dollars. It takes those dollars and it buys treasury bonds.
Mhm.
Vast oversimplification. Everything goes great. However, at some point, if Saudi hit a peak production level, if Saudi itself reached peak oil, in other words, they couldn't produce more and their existing fields rolled over. Matt Simmons famously talked about this in Twilight in the Desert in his book in '05. Let's just say again, for oversimplification, for understanding what's being said here and the importance of it, that Saudi, as an oil net exporter, their production declines in such a way that they can no longer net export oil. Their net exports drop to zero.
Mm.
And so now the world is short 20 to 25% of the oil it uses every day. Oil is about as inelastic a good as you will ever come across. And so a 20% decline in global oil supplies in a short time horizon would drive a very nonlinear rise in the price of oil. In other words, if oil was at 75 the day this happened, the next week it would probably be at 200, 250, $300, 400, $500. Who knows? Really high number. This then reverberates into the rest of that quote, feeds back into the system as follows. Remember, Saudi has spent decades trading oil for treasury bonds.
Mhm.
Now, the value of treasury bonds, which bought them, whatever, $1,000 face value divided by $75 is 13, right? 13 barrels of oil, give or take. 13? Yes, 13. It now buys them 4 barrels of oil,
Mm.
5 barrels of oil. The purchasing power
Mm.
of the bonds that where they swapped oil for bonds, now they need to buy back oil in the open market, and the value of those bonds at a face value has collapsed.
Mm.
And that assumes that the market value of those bonds have not collapsed as a result of oil now being at 200, 250, 300, which is a practical matter. They would have.
Mm.
So, furthermore, as that happens, the real value of everybody's debt in oil terms collapses. Treasuries serve not just as the bulk of FX reserves for oil exporters like Saudi Arabia, but also for oil importing creditors like China, Japan, South Korea, Germany historically were the big ones in terms of oil importing creditors to the United States. Now they are in a similar position where their treasury bonds have collapsed in value. And so you can quickly see this reverberates through the system. The value of the value in oil terms of the debt collapses. The market value of the debt crashes as everybody gets engaged in a hot potato game of get rid of the bonds as fast as you can to put your capital into something that holds value relative to oil so that your economy doesn't collapse because you can't afford oil or you run out of dollars to buy oil, in which case your currency collapses like happened in Southeast Asia in the late 90s. And that's what he's discussing is basically we had gotten through the second oil crisis. The third oil crisis is what triggers these issues. It's not a peak oil crisis in my view, and it's a peak cheap oil crisis. However, once debt gets as high as it is, that starts to be semantical on some level because basically as oil prices get higher to drive and they drive inflation, they make the underlying assets worth less. And you begin to see this global shift away from debt as a reserve asset, as a personal asset, into things that will preserve purchasing power in energy terms over time. And that's why the system would crumble.
It's great analysis. And I like how you are basically looking at the world through the lens of energy, right? Almost looking at the world through the lens of oil as money in a way, right? You're denominating things in oil, basically. So you're saying Saudi today is 25% of global net exports of oil. But then you say there's the possibility of them rolling over, which I guess this basically means they start to consume more than they produce, right? So that they stop being a net exporter and become even an importer, possibly.
It can be, the short answer is yes,
Yeah.
but it's generally geological. Number one, it's geological, right? So sticking with the Saudi metaphor, Saudi produces, call it 12 million barrels a day, or can at least. I don't know that they are at the moment, but in theory can. Of that 12 million barrels, roughly 5 million of it historically was an oil field called Ghawar, which is, I believe, nearly 80 years old at this point. And historically, oil fields last, they peak after 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. And oil fields all generally follow some version of, a bell curve. It's, again, an oversimplification, but they basically, you tap it, you find it, you tap it, you start producing. Production increases over decades, hits some point of maximum annual production. Geology, physics begins to lead to a decline. You go down the backside of this, and you can go around the world. And this is what Matt Simmons kind of showed us field after field after field. Number one, that this has happened over and over and over. Number two, he also showed that roughly and again, this was as of 20 years ago, roughly 120 or 130 fields out of a total of, call it 30 or 40,000 global oil fields, were producing around a third or more of the oil. So a very extreme version of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule.
Yeah.
And most oil fields tended to peak sometime around year 40, 50, 30, 40, 50. And most of these fields were 50 plus years old when he wrote that 20 years ago.
Wow.
So there's a geological issue here that it's not even political per se. It's not, hey, Saudi decides to consume more or they grow more so they consume more, although that can certainly contribute to that pace of the net decline for sure. Nature and physics don't care. You produce, you ramp, you peak, you roll. And that's been and that's why I think energy is so important to kind of go back to, because as long as we're using still 70% of our primary energy sources coming from oil, another chunk from gas related fossil fuel, the physics in this, They don't care. They're
Yeah.
like the Terminator. They're relentless. They
Yeah.
just keep coming. They just keep coming.
That's fantastic. And so when you say rollover, you literally mean rolling over that bell curve. Totally makes sense.
Yep.
And yeah, there's this whole idea of money as energy, I think sort of stands out here too, because you're describing Saudis exporting actual energy, oil in this case, hydrocarbons, using that to acquire US treasuries as basically a savings account, right? So it's a representation of that energy they exported. But you're talking about them getting into a situation where the purchasing power on their savings, in this case treasuries, drops from 12 or 13 barrels to 3, I think you said. So a collapse of 75% in their purchasing power. Do they see this coming? Like, how do they hedge this? The other countries that are exposed to this that you mentioned, are they looking around the corner? I mean, I think you mentioned some European countries as well. They're already in an energy crisis. What maneuvers are being taken in advance of this possibility?
So yes, I think at the highest levels of finance and geopolitics, I think this is absolutely seen. I think it's been seen for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I You can go back. The easiest way I think for listeners today to go back is go back to the late 1990s with the launch of the euro. It gets launched. In the late 1990s, the Europeans, when they launched the euro, did something very curious at the time, which was if they loved everything about the American financial system and this and the existing monetary system in terms of using American government debt as the base of the system,
Mm-hmm.
they would have put all their reserves backing the euro into treasuries and simply forever wedded their economic fortunes. As a practical matter, they would have made themselves subservient to American economic
Mm-hmm.
fortunes by doing so. But they didn't do that. What they did was something that was very surprising at the time, which was they put 15% of their FX reserves into gold and then provided for the marking to market of that gold at market price on a quarterly basis.
Hmm.
What this then does is you have a euro that is 15% of reserves in physical gold treated such that as gold goes up in price, the percentage of the reserves in the Eurozone become more gold centered, more gold based, not backed, but based, because they're not necessarily um, providing for conversion one to one,
Right.
but they become more gold based. Gold historically, and we'll touch on this later, we'll can kind of come back to it some
Yeah.
foreshadowing. Gold has held its value in energy terms extremely well
Of
over
course.
the centuries, over the
Yeah.
millennia. That's what
Yeah.
gold does.
Yeah.
This gold treatment for the Eurozone also provides for the Eurozone that in extremis, if they really get into a existential currency crisis, the European Central Bank could, in theory, wade into open markets, print euros, bid for physical gold, and by virtue of doing so, could squeeze gold markets significantly higher, and the revaluation of the gold on their balance sheet would more than offset the dilution
Mm.
of the printing the physical, which Bitcoiners will recognize as something that
Yeah.
Michael Saylor is currently doing by issuing
Yes.
MicroStrategy
Right.
shares and buying Bitcoin. And Preston Pish has been highlighting that a lot. So
Speculative
that's
attack, right? Is what they call it.
essentially yes. And so it taken back to late 1999, what this is saying is a contrast to the dollar system. So the dollar system as of late 1999 was still the dollar system under which Secretary of Treasury Connolly famously said in 1970, the dollar's our currency, but it's your problem.
Yeah.
What the Europeans did by setting up the euro and setting it up with that gold as that way was essentially saying the euro is our currency and it's our problem. In other words,
Mm.
Saudi Arabia, sell us oil in euros. We'll get oil, you'll get euros, and then you can exchange those euros for Mercedes-Benz, Airbus aircraft, Swiss watches, so on and so forth. Europe, other than energy, runs a trade surplus with the world.
Mm.
And anything net left over, you can put in gold. And over time, as we print all of our ridiculous, expending on this, that programs, and we dilute the euro, the value of gold is going to go up in euro terms, and the gold you're holding will go up in euro terms. Then when it's time to purchase, more Airbus, more Rolls Royces, more Mercedes-Benz in my box, your purchasing power is maintained in euro terms. It's a virtuous cycle of trade.
Mm-hmm.
Translated, the treatment of the euro in 1999 was, we want to set up a system that makes the euro attractive for Arab oil producers to sell us oil in our own currency, because that's the holy grail. That's how you get around the energy crisis. You either find more energy, you explore alternatives, or you buy it and you're in a currency you can print. And nobody can get printed except for the Americans, unless you're willing to basically have, you can run a current account surplus, a trade surplus, and provide for net gold settlement, which is exactly what the Europeans did. Fast forward about 12 months, late 2000, Saddam Hussein announces that he will be pricing oil in euro. It's 5-6% of the global oil market. We all know what happened then. We ultimately, in response to the 9/11 attacks, decided Iraq had a hand in it. We attacked, and after having priced oil for around 3 years in euros, after Iraq fell, that ended. And the Europeans' ability to do that kind of ended. I give this long-winded way of background is, they've known for a while that this is an issue. Again, it's not that we're running out of oil, it's a peak cheap oil energy, which is to say, the energy we need more energy to sustain the system. That energy, as a practical matter, is oil. To find more oil, the price needs to go up. But if the price of oil goes up, that begins to undermine the debt-backed dollar-centric system that has been in place for 50 years. And it turns into a vicious spike, a cycle downward. That is the third oil crisis. That is where the recycling of the dollar stops, et cetera, and the system breaks.
If you are a business owner or manager, you should know these three numbers: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000 is the number of businesses that have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, which allows you to streamline accounting, financial management, human resources, and more. NetSuite turns 25 years old this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days rather than weeks, and to drive down cost. And finally, 1, because your business is one of a kind. So with NetSuite, you get a customized solution for all your key performance indicators in one efficient system with one source of truth. NetSuite is everything you need all in one place. Right now, you can download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist designed to give you consistently excellent performance absolutely free at netsuite.com/whatismoney. That's netsuite.com/whatismoney to get your free KPI checklist. Again, netsuite.com/whatismoney.
Tell me if this is an oversimplification, but these oil exporters have been using, I guess not just oil exporters, many countries have been using U.S. treasuries as their savings tool. And now you're basically describing almost like a hyperinflation in U.S. treasuries against oil, basically, right? That the price or the purchasing power of U.S. treasuries in terms of oil is collapsing 75%. Is that, could we describe it that way? Is it like a hyperinflation of U.S. treasuries against oil? Or is that what this type of catastrophe is?
So, in short, yes, hyperinflation could be always a strong emotional word, but obviously a collapse in value against oil. And that gets into how you preserve the system, right? Because if the price of oil, it's not in the oil producer's interest to let that happen either. People say, well, if the oil goes up, it's good for them. Yes, up to a point. There's a marginal utility of oil where once it gets too high, you're going to break the system, oil demand's going to collapse, and that doesn't help them either. They are not interested in breaking the system, both from a demand standpoint, but also from a realpolitik standpoint, where if they break the system in that way, the United States Marine Corps will show up and nationalize all their oil fields, and that's not in their interest either. So there is the realpolitik in the short run of the economy. It's not in their interest to do this. In not having the Marines show up and nationalize their oil fields in a relative short to intermediate term. But critically, in the long run, geology doesn't care about any of that. Like, there's nothing the Marines can do if that Gawar field in Saudi goes 100% water cut, which is to say it stops producing. The Marines can show up with their guns and their bombs, and it doesn't friggin' matter. Oil's still going to be 300 the next day. In fact, it's probably higher just because they showed up on site. So that then lends to this systemic change where you have to have a release valve in it, right? So either oil's going to go up a lot against treasuries, but as that happens, it breaks the global economy, or you settle in a neutral reserve asset, and you let the release valve be the inflation of that neutral reserve asset that isn't used for anything, right? What do you always hear about gold? Gold's not used for anything. Precisely. If gold goes to $1 million an ounce, there's gonna be a bunch of rich Indian housewives, and there's gonna be a bunch of rich Chinese peasants, and but at the end of the day, Apple's still gonna be able to make iPhones. It's not used in any productive process. If you take oil to $1,000 a barrel to offset the debt, and as the system restructures, literally billions of people are going to starve to death globally as global trade collapses, and more than half the world can't afford food.
Wow.
And so that's what, when you look at this preparations of what the Eurozone was doing with gold, that's what that was a nod to. I think that's what that was a nod to when Russia started buying gold in 2008. I think that's what China buying gold has been a nod to over the last 15 years since the global financial crisis. Gold going up a bunch to resolve this imbalance, basically oil collapsing against gold instead of as treasuries collapse against oil, is a much happier outcome. It's one that can allow the system to continue. There's just adjustments. You just have to make sure the right players have the right amount of gold in front of them before that happens.
Right. Wow. Okay. So not to take us too far off track here, but I want to go down this rabbit hole a little bit with you. So 1971, we go off the gold standard. 1973, we go onto a petrodollar standard, roughly.
Effectively.
So a black gold standard, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
This externality you're describing, or this threat of an externality of oil going to $1,000 a barrel and collapsing global trade and billions of people starving to death, is that then a direct externality of going off of gold and onto black gold? It's like you don't want to monetize. As you said, gold's not used in hardly any productive processes. Oil's used in essentially all productive processes. So you don't want to monetize the thing you have a lot of industrial use demand for. You want to have something that you don't have much industrial use demand for. Is that sort of correct?
Yeah, and you can see this in real time, right? So there's a book, A Century of War by Robert Engdahl, where he accidentally found this Bilderberg itinerary from 1973, where basically the plan was to get Saudi to only price oil in dollars, and we know those are all public and everything. Engdahl has the itinerary. It doesn't get into all the details, but what he has talked to people that were there, where they said Kissinger said, "Look, oil's going up 400%," and that's essentially what happened. Now, we can get into the tinfoil hat, the conspiracy theories around it. Fact, from October 73 to April 74, 6 months, oil went up 400%. What did oil going up 400% do? It made the oil market basically big enough to back the foreign portion of dollar debt and set off the 1970s inflation, emerging market crises, etc., in the manner that I just described and that you just described, which is when you start monetizing a productive asset and a productive commodity, and the most important productive commodity at that, it is massively disruptive.
Mm.
And once you let the debt grow as much as it's grown since then, it would be way more than a 400% increase in oil
Yeah.
to do the same thing as you did in those 6 months. It would be catastrophic in terms of the real productive part of society. So it was done that setting aside any of the sort of conspiracy type stuff of like, did it,
Yeah.
who did it, why did it, etc. It happened. You can see the play out, and we can see from the debt levels now against the debt levels then that the amount you would have to monetize a productive commodity, it orders of magnitude higher today, which would mean the disruptions and the inflation, it would just feed on it's not possible without basically collapsing the system essentially instantly.
Yes, even if we dispense with the conspiracy theory and just say it's an unintended consequence, right? Which
Sure.
are very normal throughout human history.
Yep.
Would you
Sure.
then say this is an unintended consequence of going off of the gold standard, and the answer is to at least go back partially onto a gold standard for net settlement purposes, as you're describing?
I think de facto that's what we've started to see happen. That basically, and I critically, it's not going to be a gold standard in how most people still think of it, which is the dollar is pegged to
Yeah.
gold or the yuan's
Yeah.
pegged to gold. No, it's going to be oil pegged in a range to gold.
Yeah.
You're going to devalue oil against gold and then basically say, okay, trade will happen. As a
Yeah.
practical matter, when you really look at where the net imbalances in global trade net out, a good portion of that is around energy.
Mm-hmm.
And energy net surpluses, forget about will, they are being settled on a net basis in gold at the central bank level. We can see that with Russia. We can see that with Kazakhstan. We can see that with China. That's where this is going. And it's a much better outcome to let basically oil bid for gold, right? So the oil market is in annualized production dollar terms about 15 times the size of the gold market. It is much better to have the oil market try to squeeze into the dollar or the gold market and bid up gold.
Yeah.
Nobody starves.
Right.
Than you are trying to have the debt market squeeze into the oil market.
Right.
In which case the global economy collapses, billions starve, bad outcome.
Wow. That's, brilliant way to look at it. So I'm jumping up to page 3 now in your deck. I assume the conditions you're describing here are what are contributing to, if not exclusively causing, this global sovereign debt bubble that we're moving into. Right. I think you said the first one in 100 some odd years. What does that mean? Like I guess if there's a historic parallel that we could look at, maybe not. So what does it mean to have a global sovereign debt crisis, and what types of economic conditions should we expect to contend with?
So it really dovetails with and feeds back and forth with this peak cheap oil issue, because we know that, we can see that peak cheap oil, you need higher and higher oil prices to keep growing oil reserves and increasing oil production to support the debt. And we described the incentives that leads people that either produce oil or people that are net producers and import oil, and how that starts to not make sense for them to hold sovereign debt as their reserve asset in favor of gold or Bitcoin or assets that better preserve purchasing power and energy terms over time. So we talked about that. When you then take this step to really the other side of the same coin, which is once sovereign debt levels get above basically 100%, 90%, over the past 100, 120 years, these debt levels are always reduced one of 3 ways: sustained inflation, hyperinflation, or restructuring. And we saw this in spades throughout a lot of the emerging markets in the 1980s, basically from 1980 through 2010. And this was something we sort of, when we think of emerging markets, banana republics, this is what we think of, right? Secularly high rates of inflation and political instability and currency devaluations and sort of bad places to preserve wealth. And what this chart shows in this report is that the precursor to all of that was these countries having government debt to GDP at levels that is slightly below where the advanced economies are now. And the last time we saw this in advanced economies was in the immediate aftermath of World War I, which is why I say it's the first global sovereign debt bubble in 100 years. Everybody borrowed money from the Americans to fight World War I. And the aftermath of it was that of the 6 global industrial powers, as they stood in 1918 at the end of the war, Germany, France, England, the United States, Russia, and Japan. That's as of 1918. By 1923, the German mark had hyperinflated to basically zero against gold. The French had already devalued significantly at least once, if not twice. The Russians hyperinflated around that same time to basically zero, accelerated meaningfully by the political changes that went on there in the late teens and 20s, of course. Japanese devalued their currency by roughly 80% against gold. The winners, because there really were no winners in that, the winners, quote unquote, the Americans and the UK held out. They went back to gold, but they went back at the pre-war parity.
Yeah.
So basically, through the 20s, UK unemployment never went much below 10%, despite the fact that they had lost like 5% of their workforce, their male workforce in the war. And so you essentially had a Great Depression in the UK from 1920 through 1930. It was starting to lead to political problems where you were having fascist political parties gain gain traction in UK Parliament. Communist political parties gained traction in the UK Parliament. And in 1931, of course, they devalued the pound significantly, I think 70%. And the Americans, having been the creditor to the whole thing, we were the last ones to devalue the dollar, which we did by 75% in 1933 under FDR, taking gold from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce overnight. So point is that back then it was most of them went sustained inflation. One tried the route of deflation or restructuring with the UK, and it took a long time, but ultimately the political costs caught up. And we're in kind of the same position now at the developed market stage, where we are debt to GDP is at levels that have historically been resolved one of 3 ways: sustained high inflation, a few hyperinflations, or restructuring. When we talk about the American Treasury market specifically, which I pick on because A, I'm most familiar with it, but B, most importantly, it's the center of the system. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world. And treasuries are the collateral that underpins most of the other assets out there. You can't restructure American debt for that reason. You start writing down or restructuring that debt, you start reducing collateral, and now you need it creates a debt spiral. So your choice is sustained high inflation or hyperinflation, basically, in terms of resolving this. And when you get away from sort of short-term trading and sound bites, you see these debt levels, this is how this has worked out. And people in the world that don't need to get the month right, the quarter right, the year right, the central banks of the world, the Bank of International Settlements, this is going to come. You don't know the catalyst, you don't know the exact timing, but once debt levels hit a certain level, it's sure as night follows day, you're going to have a debt crisis. And if you have a debt crisis, when that debt is, that's how it then dovetails with and reverberates back into the energy side. If we know it can't be resolved by restructuring or making oil more valuable relative to the debt without collapsing the system, then it has to happen by making the oil less valuable relative the debt less valuable relative to the oil, which then feeds back into inflation. Like they're stuck, and they know they're stuck.
So sovereign debt above 100% GDP sits either inflation, hyperinflation, or debt restructuring.
Historically, over the last 120,
Historically,
200 years.
we're at what in the US? 130, 40%?
120
120. Yeah.
on a gross basis. Some people like to net it out. I think it's a little disingenuous to net it out, but if you net it out, it's like 98.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. So we have a debt to GDP ratio well in excess of 100. And you said we can't restructure US debt, so you would assume it's either going to be inflation or hyperinflation. The other, I guess, unique thing about the United States is we're the global superpower. Does this create incentives for us to go into armed conflict at all, which I guess would further contribute to inflation as well?
The short answer is yes. And I think the trickier problem is that once you let debt levels get to where they are, number one, but then your deficits as well, how much, not just the aggregated deficits, which is your debt, but your annual deficits. When you have structural deficits of 7 to 8% of GDP, with unemployment as low as it is, with the economy still decent, still pretty good, your flexibility to do that significantly decreases. Which is to say, if we went to open war with Russia, inflation would rise meaningfully, especially if China supported Russia, which I think is almost a sure thing, at least initially. And now, back in 1980, debt to GDP at 25, 30%. Okay, you're going to have some private sector bankruptcies as rates rise and with inflation, but there's never a threat to the solvency of the US government. At 120% debt to GDP, 7 to 8% of deficits, a war with Russia or China, with a major global power, really is not financially. It's always, everything's possible, but it's not possible without basically collapsing the bond market in such a way where the Fed has to basically buy it all. And so you're basically going to be sort of overnight hyperinflation and capital controls in the US, where not just capital controls, but goods rationing in the US. And so that's the debt and the deficit. Yes, it increases incentives to perhaps try to defend that hegemony. The debt and the deficit that we have allowed, pursuing things that we probably didn't need to pursue over the last 25, 30 years, have significantly reduced the flexibility for us to do that from here on out. People will say to me, okay, Luke, nothing's going to happen because there's no power that can overtake us. We're the world's great power. Yes. And empires compounding interest is undefeated all time against empires. We can beat on everybody in the world, but we can't beat on compounding interest. He never sleeps.
Absolutely. And empires too, I think, have a life expectancy around 250 years, which we have just passed or just about to pass the 250-year mark, I guess, in the US.
I guess we're coming up on it, aren't we? Huh?
Yeah, it's 2026, I guess. So yeah.
I would argue we probably weren't an empire until 1950. I would argue maybe we're early on in that process. the other way of looking at that, in my view, that I think has some validity is if you look at the Anglo-American empire as sort of
Yeah.
one hybrid
Right.
empire, then I think that 250 years in particular starts to be pretty relevant.
Yeah, because you mentioned Britain staying on the gold standard. I think they were only able to do that because the U.S. helped, right? We helped them defend that peg.
I think we did, and that created problems for us in
Yeah.
terms of the basically ended up showing up as the everything bubble over here in the
Yeah.
20s, in the
Yeah.
later part of the 20s in particular. So that's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's a where do you draw the line, right? The I like the Anglo-American Empire. That's probably a little more descriptive of what it actually was or even is today. Um, okay, so I'm going to page 4 here, and we're in a very unique period, basically, is the title of the slide in economic history. And you state that unless we get an energy productivity miracle soon, that we are going to be in a Mexican standoff situation. Can you explain what you mean by that? Sounds like a rock and a
Yeah,
hard place to me.
it is, and what that ultimately means is what I alluded to a little bit earlier, which is to say the debt is so high, particularly unsecured Western sovereign debt is so high that we need nominal economic growth to support the debt. To
Got it.
support that, we need incremental energy supplies.
Right.
To get the incremental energy supplies, we need higher energy prices as it relates to oil specifically. We need higher oil prices. So that's still 70% of our energy, give or take. But higher oil prices drives higher inflation, which undercuts the very debt we're trying to support
Mm-hmm.
and makes it less sustainable. So that's what I mean by this Mexican standoff, where it's really a paradox where the increased energy supplies we need right now require higher inflation, which undercuts the debt that we're trying to support with the increased energy supplies. And that's why the energy productivity miracle is sort of the caveat to that. If we're able to discover, commercialize, and ramp up, small modular nuclear reactors, nuclear fusion, other sort of things that we're on the cusp of to varying degrees relatively quickly, then that can be avoided. But failing that, especially since we've seen in the last 12 months, that a lot of the hoped for alternatives that people used to be able to say, well, no, we'll just use solar and we'll use wind. And now we're looking at solar and wind and going, solar and wind can't survive unless rates are zero, unless real rates are significantly negative, which means it's not sustainable. So at least as it relates to the debt. So that's what I mean by that you're in this Mexican standoff, this paradox where the very things you need to support the debt, higher energy inflation, undercuts the debt.
Wow. And so this specifically would have to be, as you said, an energy productivity miracle. It's not enough to just improve economic productivity. It has to be the production of energy.
Well, yes,
I was thinking
there are
AI.
other
I was
ways
going with AI. I don't know if AI could contribute to this offset or not.
AI could contribute to it. However, in my view, AI would have to arrive at just the right pace, right? So if AI arrives too quickly, you drive unemployment amongst sort of your professional class that supports your tax base, and now your deficits blow out and you create more problems, not less. It creates too much deflation against that debt. That's a problem. If it doesn't arrive soon enough, it doesn't arrive soon enough for what we just discussed. So it has to arrive at just the right time. There's again, mechanically, another way it could be done, and I want to be very careful with what I'm saying, what I'm not saying. Mechanically, if you look at where these structural deficits are, what's driving the unsustainability of it, it's entitlements. And they too are subject to an extreme version of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. And so the last 6 to 12 months of life in America are 30-40% of entitlement spend, maybe more.
Yeah.
And so if something happened where you had a lot of people die very quickly, very cheaply, that were receiving entitlements that no longer are, right now, America is spending 70% of its tax receipts, with tax receipts near all-time highs, on entitlement outflows. And so if something happened that you reduced your Social Security spend immediately, you reduced your Medicare, Medicaid spend immediately, that would, from an accounting standpoint, buy you time. That would reduce your deficits. That would reduce your annual treasury issuance, stabilize debt markets, stabilize the system. I'm not hoping for that. I'm not seeing that. I'm simply trying to make sure I'm an objective analyst where I say, okay, what else is a productivity miracle? And that's, that's obviously not a miracle, but would have the same effect from an accounting standpoint, as morbid as it is.
Got it. Very, very clear. So if I'm hearing you correctly, we need an increase in productivity to drive some price deflation to offset the price inflation that would result from the money printing that is necessary to discharge or erode the debt. And it has to be kind of like
in essence,
the right pace, the right time, and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't want it to be either very inflationary or collapse. Yeah. Otherwise the outcomes get very binary, very high inflation or economic collapse. Yeah.
Right. Wow. So this sounds very fragile to me. It's very
it
fragilized. Is. Okay. And I would, as a sound money guy, it just sounds like, what are we doing? Why did we go off that gold standard? We wouldn't have these problems. Okay. This is great stuff. All right. I'm jumping to pages 6 through 9 in your deck. You show basically that in 2022 to 23, the U.S. chose to support the bond market instead of the energy market. There's one chart you have up. You talk about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the U.S., that we were sending oil from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve to Asia and European Union. And then you go on to show, and what you basically were supporting the bond market versus the energy markets. And then I guess the question here for me is, we were shipping them oil from our Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They were paying for those shipments by selling their treasuries, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. This seems like a pretty serious strategic blunder for the United States. Why would you sell your Strategic Petroleum Reserves to a nation that has to sell your debt to buy it?
So this goes back to that initial point by Yael Zylstra that we spent a lot of time on, which is the breakdown of the system, right? So in 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. We sanction Russia. Price of oil goes up a bunch. This pushes energy importing creditors of the United States into current account deficit positions. So normally Japan runs a trade surplus. China trade surplus, Germany, South Korea trade surpluses. When oil goes up enough, they go into trade deficits. So now they're in trade deficit and budget deficits, twin deficits, and twin deficits without the reserve currency means your currency starts to fall sharply. And that's what was happening. These current account deficits by Japan, China, across Europe, a couple of countries in Europe, requires you to basically finance those current account deficits to defend your currency. Otherwise, your currency is going to fall.
No.
How do you defend your currency? You've got a pile of treasury bonds from all of your aggregated cumulative surpluses that you've been running against the United States and the world in trade over decades. So Japan was one specific example where it was most pronounced. Japan goes into a current account deficit position. How do they defend the yen from falling, which began falling sharply? sell dollars, right? So sell treasuries, get dollars, sell dollars, buy yen, and just do that. And you can see shortly after 2020, but really pronounced in 2022. I don't think I have the chart in there, but if you run a chart, a 2-axis chart of the yen dollar cross rate against the 10-year treasury yield, it is like perfect. It is like a 0.95 correlation. The lower the yen went against the dollar, the higher the 10-year treasury yield went. And so this was literally the manifestation of the system being brought to its knees that Zylstra talked about. Left to its own devices, here's how this would have gone. Japan sells treasuries to buy dollars, sells dollars to buy yen. Oil stays up. They have to sell more. The yen keeps falling, means they have to sell more treasuries. They sell more treasuries, they sell more treasuries. At some point, they run out of treasuries to sell. And then when that happens, the yen collapses like currencies did in Southeast Asia.
Right.
You have high rates of inflation, currency crises, and basically the entire global system comes unhinged. One after the other. And so, okay, how do we stop that? Well, you stop that by getting Japan back into a trade position whereby they are no longer running a trade deficit. What was causing them to run a trade deficit? Oil went up. How do you get oil back down? Well, you either make peace with Russia and pull out and lose in Ukraine, or you run down the SPR and hope that you can beat Russia in the ensuing years and before you sort of run out of SPR. And so that's why I say there was a choice. We could support the bond market by running down SPR oil to basically get our oil importing creditor allies to stop selling treasuries, to raise dollars to defend their currencies, which were collapsing after oil put them into a current account deficit position. Or we could have said, screw it, let oil keep going, let shale come on, and let all that work out. There's puts and takes to each one, but ultimately what we did amounted to price caps on the price of oil.
Right.
Artificial price caps.
Yeah.
And as we all know, price controls, they do actually work in the short term until they stop. And then on the backside of price controls, you end up with a much worse situation and higher prices. And I think that's exactly was it a strategic blunder? Tactically, it was probably the right thing to do. Right. Tactically, the right thing to do was to just not get involved in Russia, Ukraine in the first place, to just tell Russia, okay, fine, we're not going to put them in NATO and back off.
Yeah.
But barring that, tactically, probably the right thing to do was to do that. But strategically, yeah, it ends up leaving us in a much more vulnerable position because now the SPRs run down. It is not as credible a threat to reduce oil prices if there's another iteration of all of what we saw in 2022. And so here we are.
Yeah, point taken on price controls. The quote I always like to go back to there is delayed volatility is exacerbated volatility, right? Volatility.
That's a great quote. That's exactly right.
Yeah, you can sort of sweep it under the rug for a while, but it just gets bigger and nastier. Why didn't we do, and maybe this wouldn't work, but why not offer some type of swap line on USTs or even just print money and buy those foreign held USTs directly versus sending the oil? I mean, it just seems like
because
like Russia's playing the energy game, which is the actual real game.
That's the real
playing
game.
Some kind of fantasy debt game. I don't know. Like what how did we miss that?
It's not that we missed it, so we couldn't. Right. So ultimately, Japanese factories don't run on dollars. They run on oil. They run on gas. And so sending them dollars, unless they're going to stick it in the machine in the gas tank, doesn't help them. And that's where that reverberates back into a lot of things, right? Why can we go to war? Sure. But again, in wartime, nobody gives a crap if you can print your currency or how you have swap lines or whatever. It doesn't matter. Tanks and planes and stuff don't run on dollars. They run on oil.
Over the past 9 years, I've been going through a pretty serious struggle with my personal health. It started with a sharp pain and stiffness in my hip after a lifting injury, which I later learned was related to some pretty extensive inflammation in my gut. Then I developed an autoimmune issue, and soon I was having joint pain all over, skin irritations, and all kinds of digestive issues. I visited many doctors trying to figure out what was wrong, but none of them were able to help me fix any of my issues. I eventually started to see an energy healer with whom I had some limited success, but it wasn't until I started working with the biohacker Anthony DiClementi last year that I was finally able to start making real progress on my healing journey. Anthony spent a lot of time with me learning about my specific situation and worked with me to adapt a custom health plan to address my needs. Anthony has served as a personal biohacker for celebrities, billionaires, and professional athletes all over the world. Besides helping people like me overcome health issues, Anthony and his world-class medical team also help guys that just want to optimize their cognitive performance, guys that want to pack on some muscle, and guys that just want to get shredded. Anthony keeps a tight book of business and is selective about the clients he brings on. To apply for Anthony's biohacking services, text Breedlove to 847-943-7221. Again, to apply for Anthony's biohacking services, just text Breedlove to 847-943-7221. So again, if we weren't so indebted, we wouldn't have to be defending the treasury market in this way, right? So
100%. And that's a great point. And that's like the really key takeaway, right? Is I took a lot of flack for saying Russia has way more leverage than most people think. And it was really based on that's borne out, I think, in spades. And it was that whole view was based on two things. Number one, oil is the base layer of the global economy, not dollars, when push really comes to shove. And number two, our debt level was so high that you couldn't, you can't, if you're in a fight with a gas station and the gas station raising prices on you is going to bankrupt you because the resulting increase in inflation and interest rates blows up your debt, you don't have a very good position to argue from. And that's exactly, is Russia a gas station with a country like McCain said? Who knows? I don't know. Maybe. Sure. Let's just say he's right. Great. But when our debt to GDP and deficits where they are, that gas station's got way more leverage than anyone was given credit for, because the second inflation picks up, not only does it hurt our treasury market on its own, but then it spurs our allies to have to sell treasuries to get dollars to defend their currencies and buy oil. So it was really a fundamental misunderstanding by our leaders about, they were sitting, they're making policy decisions while sitting in a nitroglycerin factory soaked in gasoline and, sort of flicking matches over at Russia. It's kind of like, guys, like, have you really thought this through?
Yeah. Debt. What is John Adams? Two ways to conquer a country. One is by sword and one is by debt. And it just seems like we've really shot ourselves in the foot in a big way. But again, that is the indebtedness of the U.S. is an externality of being the global reserve currency, right? The fact that we could just keep running this deficit without tears until, again, delayed volatility is very exacerbated at the end, to the point where you're selling your strategic petroleum reserve to defend the bond market.
And some of it's right, like debt. If we to run debt up on productive things, right, where there's a positive real return over time, a productivity gain. So you run up debt on the Eisenhower highway system, great. That helps you. You run up debt on the Vietnam War, you get the 1970s. You run up debt on the global war on terror, you get what we have here, which is, what did we get for that? Well, we took 20 years and $3 trillion to take Afghanistan from the Taliban and give it back to the Taliban and to secure China's oil supplies in Iraq for them. And you kind of go, wasn't a really good use of debt. And we got zero payback on that. And like you said, we're just now starting to see the payback for that. The devil always takes the hindmost.
Great point. When you finance investment, that's okay. It's productive investment. But when you finance current consumption, which effectively that's what you're doing when you fund war, doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, I guess you could argue if there's something to be taken or, whatever, that would be the rationale, but certainly seems to not be working.
No.
A little further down, I'm on page 18 now. You start to go through a few potential paths forward from this rather sticky situation. And you're basically saying you could either, I'm not sure. Oh, as U.S. shale rolls, the U.S. will have to either import more oil, get more energy efficient by investing in alternatives, raise rates dramatically to crash the global economy, reducing demand for oil, or restructure the global monetary system. Could you expand on the restructuring of the global monetary system? I know this is related to the gold net settlement you mentioned earlier, but how significant of a restructuring would this be? Is this a Bretton Woods 2.0 kind of event, or how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I mean, in effect, yes. I think it's already underway de facto. And the restructuring of the system, I think, is the way it's going to go, because the first three can kind of work in the short run for like a second, but in the end, they just, in no small part because of peak cheap oil and the debt being where it is, they just create more problems than they solve in relatively short order. The restructuring of the system is essentially shifting from reserving treasuries to as a global primary reserve asset to reserving gold at a floating price. And we're watching that happen. We can look that since 2014, global central banks have net sold about $400 billion in treasuries over 10 years, and they've net bought about $500 billion in gold, both at market. That is the restructuring. That goes back to that initial point we talked about earlier, which is, okay, the debt in and of itself is unsustainable. The energy situation of peak cheap oil, where we're needing to increase price to increase production to support the debt, that makes it doubly unsustainable and increasingly unstable. And then your choice is try to fit the debt market into the oil market, which is to say you hyperinflate oil, the system collapses, or you try to fit the oil market into the gold market, in which case gold goes up a bunch. The system structure effectively changes so that gold replaces treasuries as global reserve asset. It is destabilizing on some level from the standpoint that it is going to force a revaluate. It's going to force the U.S. to do one of two things, right? If the world's central banks are no longer buying our debt, we either have to cut our spending or accept structurally higher interest rates and finance our own spending, or we need to basically devalue the dollar, the debt, a ton by virtue of the Fed buying much of those deficits for some period of time and sort of revaluing the dollar against gold and against other currencies. Is that destabilizing to certain current interests? Yes. Is it a bad thing for the United States? No. Right? When we talk about wanting to reshore and that we need to bring back some of the defense industrial base, that can't happen while our biggest exporter, dollars and treasuries. We need to actually get back to making something, which this would do. So that's what restructuring looks like. The restructuring is just you stop reserving treasuries and you start reserving gold at a floating price in all currencies at the central bank level. And that's been underway for 10 years.
Right.
I think it's really accelerated since 2022.
And this is a reversion, if we zoom out, it's a reversion to the mean, right? That, well,
100%.
Right? Yeah.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Most people are like, oh, this is, the last 50 years have been the anomaly. This is sort of going back,
and
for a long time.
You're leading me perfectly into your next slide here, which is page 23. You have this great chart, oil prices from 1861 to 2022, showing oil prices on a gold standard basically flat, right? I mean, there's one
for 110 years.
Yeah, one little bump
for 110 years.
World War I. Everything else is solid, and then something happens in 1971, and it's gone bonkers since. And so this is everything you're describing is like just sort of built into that, right? This is just the tail end. Well, I don't know where the tail end is, but it's the latest in that pattern, basically, right? That oil's been ripping ever since we went off the gold standard.
Yeah, that's exactly it. When you price energy in real money with an energy base,
Yeah.
your incentives as an oil producer
Yeah.
change, right? If you're getting paid in kind,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're getting paid in something that preserves your value,
Mm.
then your incentive is to produce full out. Because like I just said, the oil market in annual global production dollar terms is about 15 times the size of the global gold market. If you settle oil on a net basis in gold, game theory as an oil producer is run the taps full out and get the gold early, because 15 times the size means the price of gold is going to go up,
Yeah.
right? So over time, you can see it over the long run that really gold has bought a little bit more oil annually
Yeah.
over time, which
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is post 1971, when you go into silly season of pure fiat world, if you are now settling in a debt-backed currency, and the debt is the unsecured debt of a sovereign, suddenly your game theory changes dramatically. You need a cartel. You need to restrict production of energy to manage the price of oil, to support the value of that debt, to support the value of that currency. And it's something that once you say it and hear it, you can't unhear it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something most people have never thought of in terms of OPEC. Why does OPEC exist? OPEC exists because we went off the gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
In short, that's why.
Mm-hmm.
If you went back to basically settling energy in gold and not in debt, you have no need for a cartel.
Wow.
The optimal game theory is run full out, produce as much oil as you can. Now, is that good or bad? For humanity, that's wonderful. More energy is good. More energy drives more economic production. And tying back to the point of this presentation of you need an energy miracle to get out of this, here's your energy miracle. Fix the currency, settle energy in gold at a floating rate. You could do it in Bitcoin, and that's a discussion we can continue later. I don't think we go from here to right to Bitcoin, but you could. But if you have a neutral reserve asset with an energy tie whose price stays stable to rises slightly in energy terms over time, you're going to have an energy surplus just by virtue of your incentives that sets up. And there's your energy productivity miracle that kind of saves, it kind of keeps the worst outcomes, takes the worst case outcome tail off of this whole discussion.
Thanks to my friends at Swan Bitcoin for supporting the show. Swan sponsored the Sailor series, and I appreciate their support from the very beginning of the What is Money show, and I'm happy to welcome them back. Swan has grown a lot since then. They've built a full-service, Bitcoin-centric financial services company with several different offerings. With the Swan app, you can set up instant and recurring Bitcoin buys, and with this, you can get started at swan.com/breedlove. Swan also enables clients in the US to hold Bitcoin directly in an IRA account, so you can hold Bitcoin in a tax-advantaged way. Get started at swan.com/IRA. If you're looking to buy more than $100,000 worth of Bitcoin, check out Swan Private. You'll get concierge support for buy execution, retirement accounts, inheritance and estate planning, and access to exclusive events, research, and other content. Get started at swan.com/private. Swan Institutional provides financial services to institutions, including Bitcoin-backed lending, asset management, principal investments, Bitcoin services for financial advisors, and Bitcoin mining operations. For those new to Bitcoin, I recommend checking out Swan's Welcome to Bitcoin course at swan.com/welcome. So go to swan.com/breedlove today to get started on your Bitcoin buying journey. And an incredibly strong and I would say even novel argument for sound money. It's just like
100%.
it's like it really resolves so many of these negative externalities just sort of vaporize when you take things back to a sound monetary base. I thought it was interesting too that you brought up OPEC as, obviously they're an oil cartel as another externality of going off of the gold standard. And we went off the gold standard because, well, guess what? We cartelized the money via the central bank. So I guess cartels
It's a
beget
great point.
cartels. Um, so
It's a great point, right? Like, not a lot of people think about this. I think it did factor into the decision not to go off gold. And then, it was you can see this it's not in this presentation, but you can find them in declassified State Department documents that basically Arabs liked gold.
Mhm.
And if you looked at in 1970, US oil peaked domestically. And our sources of energy were increasingly oil producers in the Middle East, in an economically sensitive part of the world, a very large percentage. It was absolutely understood by some people in Washington that part of what would happen once we closed the gold window is that the price of oil would go up a lot.
Mhm.
As basically Arab oil producers that were getting gold would start raising oil prices because now they're getting paper,
Mhm.
and that their ensuing rise in the price of oil would make economic oil supply basins in friendlier parts of the world that were known to exist, but which were uneconomic without a significant rise in the price of oil.
Right.
Alaska, Prudhoe Bay, Cantarell, the other deep water in the Gulf of Mexico, UK North Sea. We knew this stuff was there, but it was the break even on it was you couldn't produce it.
Mhm.
Take away the gold backing, price of oil goes up, as you can see in that chart. And now, voila,
Mhm.
UK North Sea booms,
Mhm.
deepwater Gulf of Mexico booms, Alaska production booms. Changes the geopolitical mix of the US's energy, significantly weakens the relative energy position of the USSR at a time when the USSR was, in a lot of ways, winning the Cold War. And so it's one of these things where it's easy to argue in hindsight, going off the gold standard in 71 did create a lot of externalities. From a geopolitical standpoint, it was arguably a very important
Yeah.
contributor to winning the Cold War, to basically securing a domestic supply of energy. We can see this repeated, right, with shale.
Yeah.
We had no shale at $20 a barrel, and at $150 a barrel, we're now one of the biggest oil producers in the world, in terms of the shale that came on in the move up to 150 to 08, and it's been at 80 ever since. So as with a lot of policies, there's puts and takes, there's geopolitical, there's
Yeah.
domestic, there's inflation, there's monetary, and all these things have to be considered. And that's one of those that I think is not that well understood in terms of the implications of it.
Yeah, and it's short run, long run too, right? Things that we do in the short run to accomplish certain objectives with unforeseen consequences in the long run, oftentimes.
That's right.
Um, pretty normal human experience. The other thing that jumps out to me here is, again, oil having such a high degree of industrial use demand makes it a really bad idea to monetize. Gold having very low industrial use demand makes it a great idea to monetize. I guess because industrial use demand is sort of crowding out monetary use demand, or vice versa, right? Depending which way it's going. So you just want the thing that's most useful as money, basically. So I guess I'm working towards Bitcoin is ideal in the situation that has zero industrial use, right? It's just a pure money. So yeah, gold obviously would fix a lot of this, but I think Bitcoin would work just as well. But I also agree with you. We don't go from A to C, right? There's going to be a progression towards that. Um, one more I want to mention page 26. You have a chart, and this was shocking to me. More than 50% of global oil exports are coming out of, I think this is correct, Saudi Arabia, Russia, UAE, and Iran. 50% of the
Yeah.
oil in the world,
Yeah.
four places.
And all of them are either already in the BRICS or
Yes.
going into the BRICS soon, in theory.
Yes. So, I mean, yeah, you hear this a lot in the US. So like, oh, there's nothing to worry about. That BRICS stuff is total BS. But I'm like, I think you should pay attention, right? It's like these are the biggest energy exporters in the world, making their own currency block. So worth paying attention to. Um, and I wanted to jump to this slide here. It's page 29. You show Russia has increased its gold reserves roughly 400% over the past roughly 15 years. And one of the key lessons I keep learning while studying the history of money, and we've touched on it a lot today already, is that geopolitical power shifts and they closely track international gold flows, right? Like whoever has the gold sort of makes the rules. This is why, US won World War II and then held Bretton Woods conference, things like that. What does Russia's gold stack mean for potential or ongoing geopolitical tensions with the US going forward?
So in the presence, Russia's gold stack in the presence of what is still very, very low external dollar debt for Russia, them being a nuclear armed power, them being at least as far ahead in some technologies like hypersonics, etc., as we are. And when you layer in that their position in that chart on the prior page of net exports, I want to say they're 18 or 20% of global oil net exports.
Yeah.
What it means is that Russia's leverage is far greater than you hear in the Western media. No matter how much gnashing of teeth and shaking of fists and calling Tucker a traitor and all of this stuff, and that Putin's a liar. Is Putin a liar? Sure. He's a politician. They're all liars. Is he a Merce liar? Maybe. Guess what? Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Gold, oil, low debt, nukes. And then especially when you see the partnership and the growth in trade between they and China, China's the factory of the world. And this is another point that I think people tend to miss in the context of this global sovereign debt crisis and energy, etc. The factory of the world in the last one was the US.
Mm-hmm.
The factory of the world this time around is not the US. We're the reserve currency, but we are not the factory of the world.
Right.
In 1918, we were making a lot of strides. We were the factory of the world, but the UK was the reserve currency of the world.
Mm-hmm.
By 1945, we were the reserve currency of the world. China is not the reserve currency of the world. They are the factory of the world. We're the reserve currency of the world. We've gotten ourselves indebted doing some dumb things geopolitically, just like the UK did from 1914 to 45. Mm-hmm. Do I think the yuan is going to be the reserve currency of the world? No. And China has specifically said that is not what they want, because they have looked at how that goes. They tend to take a longer term view of things, and they understand the Triffin's dilemma, which is you have to run the debt to run the deficits to supply the currency, and you end up hollowing out your domestic industrial base, your defense base. You leave yourself weak and over indebted, and here we are. And they don't want to do that. They have repeatedly said for 15 years that they want to use gold to internationalize the yuan, and their mark of an internationalized yuan is the ability to invoice for oil and gas and commodities in yuan and net settle in gold. And that's the system that they're moving toward. It's the same thing that the Europeans were theoretically trying to move towards in the late 90s when we started off this discussion. And the difference is that we've got a lot of military bases. We, the US, have a lot of military bases in the EU, and we have exactly zero in China, which is a very important thing. So to answer the question directly, it means Russia has way more leverage, way more staying power, particularly when paired with China, than virtually everybody in the Western mainstream media says.
Yeah. Again, seems like they're playing the game at a higher level in some respects. But not that I'm super well versed on this whole thing, but there just seem to be some obvious areas where Russia is doing what I would consider to be the right move, and we're not. And this accumulation of gold is one of them. Do we have numbers on U.S. gold accumulation? I'm sure it's nothing like Russia's in terms of percentage
We've got
change.
more. It's less per capita or less per GDP, but we have
Yeah.
8,100 tons. I want to say Russia's got, I don't know, 2,100 tons or something like that, or
Yeah,
2,200
but
tons,
the net
1,800 tons. But
change is much less, I would assume, right?
oh, we haven't officially added any since 1971 or 68, and we haven't
Right.
even audited it in 50 years.
Yeah,
So
I was gonna
in
say.
theory, it's there. A bunch of guys that
Yeah, just
that,
trust
that
us.
look like you and have guns, standing outside saying, "Hey, it's there. Trust us." And
Yeah, well, as we say in Bitcoin, don't trust, verify. So I would not be surprised to find out that gold is not there. Okay, broad question here. How, and we sort of alluded to it earlier, but how does Bitcoin fit into the picture of everything we've discussed so far today?
So I think it fits in the picture in a number of ways. Broadly speaking, in my opinion, and there's a lot of stuff you can find this online, Bitcoin does a lot of what gold does better than gold does it.
Mhm.
There is a very large financialized gold infrastructure that makes gold much more beholden to the Western interest rate differential financial system. That is not true for Bitcoin. That's why I've repeatedly called it for years the last functioning smoke alarm. Basically, it has not been
Right,
disabled with the unadulterated expansion of unallocated paper derivatives centered in London, like gold for a long time has done. And as such, I think for away from, do we go from A to C or A to B to C as in terms of the evolution of the monetary system in coming years and decades, the average person doesn't have to care. You
Mhm.
just own some Bitcoin and you're already at sea, and you can sort of, go to the beach and have a Mai Tai and wait for everyone to catch up. And, if you're unlevered, yeah, there's gonna be volatility. So what?
Mhm.
If you're unlevered and you're positioned properly in terms of sizing, it doesn't matter. You should be just
Mhm.
fine and be well prepared to maintain and probably gain purchasing power through the evolution of and change of the system.
Mhm.
Um, when you then take it up to the policy level and hypothetical theoretical, if we can see what China and Russia are clearly doing with gold and moving it back into the system as a neutral reserve asset at a floating price, and we can see how it makes way more sense for humanity to fit oil into gold than rather than trying to fit the debt into oil.
Mhm.
But that doing that will significantly or disproportionately increase Russia and China's political and monetary system power slash votes relative to ours, particularly if the gold is not where we say it is. Then there is a view of game theory. I've talked about it before. It's been a couple years, but gold does a lot of, or excuse me, Bitcoin does a lot of what gold does better than gold. Bitcoin will be harder on a stock to flow ratio
Mhm.
than gold after the next halving, if I'm not
Mhm.
mistaken.
Mhm.
You would know that better than me. It will be at some point,
Yeah, I
regardless.
think it goes to double gold in roughly April this year.
Okay, so to that extent, then Bitcoin in theory could serve as a trump card. Let's say, worst case, uh, we don't have the gold. We sold most of it to finance Vietnam and all these other shenanigans and black ops and stuff for
Mhm.
years,
Mhm. Mhm.
and try to preserve dollar hegemony. And so we don't have a lot. And Russia and China not only have a lot, but way more than they say, which is very possible, certainly in the case of China. Um, then this sort of revaluation of gold to recapitalize global central banking is going to be effectively a transfer of wealth and power from America to China.
Mhm.
If we wanted to trump that, if we wanted to short circuit that, and a wise American administration could come out and say, we're going to sell trade Bitcoin. We've got the hardest currency. You guys went, you bought all that. Congratulations. But us and our allies, we're going to use the harder currency still. And it would be a monetary game set match, because now they've got to take the gold they've acquired to buy up Bitcoin. And every ounce of gold they spend is going to devalue their gold against Bitcoin for all the reasons you and all Bitcoiners, myself included, understand. Do I think that'll happen? No.
Yeah.
Do I think there are people in the American establishment, Washington broadly, that understand this game theory? I know there are.
Yeah.
I know there are.
Yeah.
Do they have enough power to do something like this? I don't know at the moment, but that's a scenario that, again, I don't want that to be like, oh God, that's going to happen.
Sure.
That's like way out there on the tail risk.
Sure.
Could it happen? Is there any practical reason it couldn't? No, but just gaming it out. So, now to do that, by the way, Bitcoin would probably have to add at least 2 zeros to the end of where it trades today. But that's another way as we look around this where, we need to restructure the system anyway. And that's an endemically fair way of doing it.
Yep.
It's transparent, it's movable, it's efficient, it's all of the things you need. People say, well, it's not fair. People who own Bitcoin are going to get rich. And well, like, that's in the cake. Like, either the system's going to collapse, or the people who own oil are going to get super rich and we're all going to starve. Or the people who own gold are going to get rich and we're not all going to starve. And that's going to really enrich a couple of our adversaries. Or the people who own Bitcoin are going to get rich. And, oh, by the way, we're at least as well represented as Americans in that case. And in terms of our open economy and stuff, we can leverage it more than arguably places like China and Russia could. So to me, it would be win-win. I think there would be a lot of wood to chop between here and there. You have to get a lot more desperate. You have to change over some leadership. Some people need to move on, blah, blah, blah. But that's how I've thought about it.
Are you sick of being robbed by politicians through inflation and endless money printing? If so, you need to be at Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville, Tennessee on July 25th through 27th. As the largest Bitcoin and fintech conference in the world, Bitcoin 2024 stands as a beacon of monetary freedom, a glimmer of hope amongst a darkening macroeconomic backdrop. Top speakers, companies, and thought leaders from across the industry will convene in Nashville to look ahead to the next year and beyond. I will be there, and Bitcoin conferences like this have become my favorite place to socialize since becoming a Bitcoiner. Ticket prices will increase soon. Get your tickets now and secure your spot at this game-changing event. So go to b.tc/conference and use discount code Breedlove to sign up for the Bitcoin 2024 conference. Again, that's b.tc/conference, discount code Breedlove.
It's fascinating to hear you say it out loud, but yeah, it's just fascinating thought experiment. I'm reminded too of Pascal's quote that science advances from funeral to funeral. So we probably just, as you said, we need to chop a lot of wood. Would it be more likely, this is something that's concerned me, that an authoritarian regime would take that maneuver instead because they just have concentrated decision making, right? It's easier for an authoritarian regime to be agile and move quickly to this kind of Bitcoin trump card strategy. So say a China or a Russia, they could sort of double down on their gold position and say, oh yeah, and we've got the Bitcoin. Would you see that as being more likely, let's say, than the US making a maneuver like that?
I don't think China would. Like, to me, it has to come from, I guess China in theory could if they had enough Bitcoin at first, but you've got to, the guy who does it has to be one of three people. It's got to be either the US. The US can do it as the incumbent, right? So we've got the dollar, we can do it.
Yeah.
And we've got the oil too. We have
Yeah.
the oil to do it, where, we now that's important. We have the energy. The Chinese are short the energy, but they're the factory of the world. So they could in theory do it if the Russians went along. Like the Russian energy, right? Like if Russia came out and said, we now reserve beanie babies
Yeah.
we're only taking beanie babies for our oil. That's all it would take. Boom, you're done. Saudi could do the same thing, I guess, in theory, but Saudi doesn't have nukes. Saudi's, protectorate of the United States. That's not going to happen. Russia could do it. And, Russia, we're now going to take beanie babies for our oil only. And the price of beanie baby goes through the roof and beanie baby production goes up. And so if they say, hey, we're only taking Bitcoin for our oil, that would do it, but their biggest clients wouldn't like that much, right?
Yeah.
So unless their biggest clients already had the Bitcoin. So when you look at from Russia and China, I think when you talk through it, it makes it more likely they would do that with gold, right? And sort of Zoltan highlighted that, and so did I can't think of his name off the top of my head. Putin's one of his economic advisors, citing Zoltan, saying that in terms of, hey, we'll, instead of 1 gram a barrel, it's now 2 grams a barrel, or 2 barrels a gram. Instead of 1 gram a barrel, 1 barrel a gram, it's now 2 barrels a gram. Both of them have gold that revalues their FX reserves instantly, and it makes them more sustainable. So when you talk through it like that, I apologize for taking so long to answer the question, but to me, it's possible, but until they have the piles of Bitcoin ahead of time, I'm not sure that it makes sense for them to do that.
Right.
And if they start piling up the Bitcoin, we're all going to know it.
Well, I wonder. I wonder how, certainly you can pile up some Bitcoin without anyone knowing. The incentive for anyone that has the power, as you're describing here, whether it's Russia, China, US, would be to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible before you let anyone know that you've been doing that. Because once you do that, that triggers the game theory.
Yep.
So I wonder what that cusp is. Like, how much Bitcoin can you pile up before you notify your game theoretic adversaries and trigger this whole process? Also interesting to think about.
Yeah, exactly. The Saudis saw that in the 70s, right? When they started bidding for gold just ran away from them. And, the Russians have they're buying a gold over the last 15 years has basically just been saying the price of gold is BS. Unallocated gold derivatives have kept the price of gold too low for too long. And so, all right, we'll take the gold. We'll take the gold. We'll take the gold. We'll swap energy for gold. And, people say, well, gold hasn't gone anywhere for 15 years. And you're like, well, when Russia started buying gold, and when China started pricing oil in yuan in 2014, the price of gold and oil was 8 barrels an ounce. And now it's like 25, 26.
Right.
So the price of gold has tripled in oil terms in the last 10 years. It just hasn't shown up, partly because the Americans have increased oil production, partly because, so yeah, it's an interesting thing to talk through.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, one last sort of curveball-ish question. Again, out in the theoretical, hypothetical domain, this is probably a century away if it ever did happen. But I put this tweet out. This is just me thinking out loud. I wanted to share it with you and hear your views. I tweeted that gold can already be artificially produced, but not yet at a cost below its market price. One of the many mind-blowing aspects of Bitcoin is that it functions as a global bounty program for bringing more cost-effective energy sources into production. How ironic will it be if Bitcoin drives the cost of energy so low that lab-grown gold can be produced below its market price, thereby compromising gold's utility as a reliably scarce money and thus destroying its store of value functionality? I'm a fan of gold, actually. I'm a big fan of gold, but I'm a bigger fan of Bitcoin. And this particular thought experiment really intrigues me. So I wanted to throw it over to you and hear what you thought about it.
You're gonna get me killed with the gold crowd. No, I agree 100% on Bitcoin stimulating marginal energy production conceptually over time, right? So in theory, I've got a little creek behind me and there's a little waterfall and there is potential, there is not being potential, there is energy there that is just being completely wasted. And that if I could set up a system enough such that I could, put up a turbine, water wheel, and I could create electricity, hook it up to a Bitcoin mining rig, and I could, and in theory, start to bring that electricity into the system that was otherwise just being wasted. That is good for mankind to the extent that that happens over time around the world, etc. Your marginal production cost of electricity in particular moves towards zero. And then, I don't know the physics well enough and the amount of energy involved, blah, 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 blah. But let's just say there is some amount of electricity applied to the right molecules in the right order, and you can create gold. Then, yeah, you end up not just with extremely demonetized cheap gold, but you get, extremely cheap demonetized everything, right? Because in the grand scheme of things, if you get this power, like gold's I don't know if it'd be the last thing I would do. I guess you'd probably do it because you could make it and sell it and bring the price down. I guess it would be the first thing you do, right? You would sell it and sell into the market at 2,000, 1,900, 1,800, 1,700, so on and so forth. From a humanity, what's best for humanity? Copper, right? Copper, you'd be resolving what is a growing issue in copper, rare earths, particularly if you could do so in an environmentally friendly way. Lithium, it'd be super powerful, right? Because it would be a lot of different materials that in theory you could do that with. I don't know if that's possible. Anyway, just thinking out loud, but
no, that's interesting.
I agree.
It would bring down, because if you bring down cost of energy is an industrial input to basically everything. So you'd make all these things more cheaply, assuming you can make these things in a lab too. I don't know if you can make copper.
Yeah, and I don't, and exactly. Yeah, exactly. But it's, I think the most important thing is because Bitcoin in some circles gets a bad rap as, oh, look, we're burning as much as, an African country to burn Bitcoin. Yes. And that's an extremely narrow and politicized dogmatic view of the energy use of Bitcoin. Once you start taking the step back and say, wow, this incents the behavior and makes economic, bringing on these otherwise trapped sources. Then you get into the sort of the Texas examples we've seen, right, where there is capacity being built to fuel rigs that can get switched off and sold to the grid at peak rates or at peak season when the alternative would have been brownouts and people in the cold or people in the heat, because those Bitcoin rigs can be shut down and the electricity they were consuming sent into the grid. That's good, not so I think it spurs the question of the holistic view of Bitcoin energy use, the energy tie, how that is good for economic development and the environment, et cetera, then you could get, in theory, at some point down the road, sure, I guess it could happen. But that's, I think I don't have the physics to know, and it's probably a long way off at any rate.
Yeah, it would be fascinating because then all of that, it would demonetize everything basically. And then it would also radically increase productivity by making energy very cheap. And a lot of that productivity would flow into the purchasing power of Bitcoin then. So interesting to think about.
It'd be a virtuous economic cycle, because now all of a sudden people are, it'd be like a new Uber renaissance. I mean, it'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, pretty cool. Something to think about, dream about, hope for, I guess. Probably a ways off, but Luke, man, this has been an absolute dynamite conversation. You always bring the heat, and I really appreciate you doing that again today.
I appreciate it.
Where can people find you on the internet?
Sure. So our website, FFTT-LLC.com, for people interested in either institutional or mass market research information. And you can find me on X at Luke Gromen, LukeGromen.
Awesome. Luke, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.